Classics can really be a valuable resource for scholars and students in political communication. And we will share the links to this channel with you after this session. Please note that we will only record also the presentation. I see that the recording also has just started. We will, of course, end the presentation with time for a Q&A, but the Q&A itself will not be recorded or put online. And so this brings me to the real start of the PolCom Classics with the first speaker. Today we have the honor to kick off the PolCom Classics with Rens Vliegenthart, who will tell you more about the connections and the frictions between political sciences and communication sciences, the two fields that we combine in our research. Rens is professor and shareholder of strategic communication at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and he's a well-known expert in studying the interaction between media and politics and the effects of media content on citizens, public opinion, politicians, and political decision-making. He's also been a PI of several large-scale political communication projects, including also his current project on this content framing. And most of all, he's a great speaker, so we really look forward to your kickoff talk. So Rens, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ine. It's an honor to be the first one to speak in this series. But I'm also not 100% sure whether my story today really classifies as a classics, in the sense that we're not going to talk too much theory. I'm also going to not act too academically, but just go to be a little bit exaggerating, rude, etc. But it might be a good start to kind of think a little bit about how does the political communication field actually look. This is a talk I gave a few months ago, or a version of this talk I gave a few months ago in Antwerp, and some of you were there, so you'll hear a couple of things that you might actually already heard before, and I have to give credits to Peter van Aalst, who came up with the idea. I was there. He said you also have to talk for a little bit to the group. Why don't you do something light? For example, the differences between the Netherlands and Flanders, or the difference between Amsterdam and Wageningen, or the difference between political science and communication science. And I like the latter a little bit better, because that kind of gave us a little bit the opportunity to talk a bit about substance, but also have a little bit of a broader story. So what I will do today is introduce you to the fight that exists in this case. And here we actually see two political communication scholars, Stefan Walgraven and Peter van Aalst, both work in Antwerp. And what the unique thing in this case is that in Antwerp, political communication is actually positioned within the political science department. And we actually see that that's in the Low Countries an exception. And we actually see that most of the PolCom research is actually happening in communication science disciplines.
Katja had gesagt.
On the left-hand side, you see Stefan, who we kind of classify as a real political scientist, and then on the right-hand side, we see Peter, who we then would classify as maybe a real communication scientist, but he disagreed with that right away when I said that a few months ago. But in this case, they are both in the same group, but they do distinctively different research. And they used to work together a lot, but they don't work that much together anymore. And that kind of started off this puzzle or this idea, all right? So how do those different disciplines, those different maybe foundational disciplines actually look differently or similarly at the questions that are central in the things that we kind of study? As I said, I will be exaggerating, and we'll kind of emphasize the differences that exist rather than the many similarities that are present too. And we also know that there's of course a high level of diffusion. We also know that in a lot of communication departments also political scientists work, and the other way around. I myself work with political scientists as well as communication scientists. But let's just kind of, for the fun of it, also see how there might be actually differences. And I want to talk about three different things. The first one is substance. What kind of different questions do communication scientists and political scientists typically ask? What are the theoretical and methodological approaches that they use? Then a little bit about the institutions. Basically, we're among communication scientists here, right, with NeFCA. Otherwise, we had to go to the NKWP or the VPW, I think, in Flanders. And we kind of see those differences kind of really translate into different levels internationally and nationally as well. And then to end the story with, I will say a few things about differences in culture and people. And this will be the most provocative part, I think. I studied political science myself, so that's actually my first disqualifier. And one thing I think that up until my maybe 10 years ago or so, I said, well, my big dream is still to become a professor in political science. I let that go completely. I now kind of identify as a real communication scientist, and I also think that that's a lot more fun, and also people-wise, but also substantially, this is usually the place where I feel best. However, I think that probably the similarities are actually bigger than the differences, and we also see that in terms of substance, where we see that a lot of the main theories and also probably underlying research questions are kind of shared by both disciplines. But interestingly enough, we also see that in a lot of instances they haven't been talking that much to each other, and it have really been separate fields, you could kind of say. And I think one of the most clear examples in this regard is agenda setting research, where we in communication science all know McCombs and Shaw, who I think now both passed away, but I don't dare to say that with 100% certainty. But these are basically the people who came up with this idea of agenda setting, right? That we kind of say, well, the media might not be so successful in telling us what to think, but where to think about. That quote is actually from Cohen in the 60s. And here the focus is very much on the impact of media on public opinion. And interestingly enough, also on the political science, or maybe even more on the policy side, there has also been a huge interest in agendas. And there we see two other grand men, Baumgartner and Jones, Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones, who mainly talk about policy agendas, but also include media agendas. And they're, for example, known for this book, Agendas and Instability in American Politics. And they assume very similar mechanisms to kind of take place. They're more interested maybe in the legislative part and in the political decision-making part, but still also they kind of look at issue salience, also ask questions about the transfer of issue salience, also have great ideas and thoughts about the dynamics of issue salience. But these two fields, so the communication agenda setting people and the political science agenda setting people, they seem to kind of be, they have to kind of develop really distinct from each other and haven't been talking that much to each other. So they're kind of aware that the others exist, but that's about it. So this is just an example where we actually see that very similar questions are asked. Also, actually, very similar methodological approaches are actually being used, because both sides rely a lot on content analysis, but also on some public opinion research, but still see that they don't talk that much to each other. And more broadly, we kind of see these kind of things reflected also in where do those two disciplines, and I'm again exaggerating, I'm again kind of really emphasizing the differences here, focus on in terms of the substantial questions that they address. And I think that if we kind of look at political communication from a communication science perspective, you could say that very central in those ideas are discussions about what we would call the high choice media environment, or maybe media fragmentation. And the interest is then on both supply and demand sides, you could kind of say, factors that are of importance here. And on the supply side, we see, for example, that indeed the rise of new technologies and social media, and maybe recently also of generative AI, creates a situation where you have an abundance of information, but also a fragmentation of information. And there are a lot of questions being asked about the quality of information. And the quality of information can be about mis and disinformation, can also be about to what degree content is incivil, is polarizing, etc., etc. So really kind of focusing on how has this new media environment changed in terms of its substantial characteristics. And on the other hand, on the demand side, you see a lot of work and a lot of studies on things like a lack of trust, mainly in media, in traditional journalism, maybe also a little bit on the political side, and then behavioral consequences that really tap into how people deal with media and with news and maybe political information. And one of the things that, for example, kind of stands out there is minimal news consumption, news avoidance, etc. I mean, I'm not here to kind of sketch a complete and conclusive summary of the whole field, but these are the type of questions communication scientists within political communication typically deal with. That's a little bit different if we kind of look at a more of a political science perspective, you could kind of say. And I think one of the things that is very central in the recent literature here is the focus on democratic quality, you could kind of say. And for example, a very quickly rising strand of research on polarization and radicalization, and their media play a role because media are kind of seen as maybe causing part of those developments, but kind of starting also more with, you could kind of say basically starting here with the dependent variable, if we kind of conceptually say it, where you have political phenomena that we're interested in, and media might be one of the factors that impact those attitudes, those behaviors, but maybe also those more on a societal level, general processes. And a lot of those discussions recently have, of course, kind of been presented also as in a more general theme relating to democratic erosion or democratic backsliding, where we see that in all kind of contexts and situations, the quality of information has been, the quality of democracy in different countries has actually been going back according to all kind of different standards. Traditionally, there's also quite a lot of interest in those typical political outcome variables like political trust, political knowledge, maybe also participation, voting behavior. So these are then really like basically the dependent variables that the political scientists kind of try to explain, and where media then might actually kind of come into the equation as well. And then in the fourth one is maybe, and that's one that's actually also worthwhile to kind of consider, is political elites and how they kind of use or might actually use the media environment, but also information in their, for example, political decision-making processes. So that's a bit of a very broad, you could kind of say, analysis of the main differences. And this kind of translates also a little bit into basically on which side of the political communication two-word thing are you? Are you more interested in the communication side, and indeed in these changes in media environments and in these media use things and in this news avoidance thing, or are you more interested in politics in terms of what does media do? What do media do for political behavior of citizens on the one hand, and maybe also the behavior of political elites? There is also an interesting qualitative difference here, I think, but this is I mean, I don't have that much empirical evidence, but only a lot of anecdotes in this regard. But political communication in communication science is seen as a high-quality field, as a central field in the communication discipline more broadly. You also see that a lot of PolCom studies are actually getting published in the leading journals in the field. You see that. I'll talk a little bit about the institution, but also, for example, in the ICA, but also in the NeFCA, we see a very prominent role for political communication. That's not the case in political science. I kind of recall when I started my PhD, and it's a long time ago, I know, in 2004, political scientists were really like, and I studied political science and I knew quite about it. It was like, what are you going to do? You're going to do something with media? Is that interesting? We all know that. And then there's this one article, I think at 1999, from Newton, which kind of says, may the weak force be with you, which was unpublished, I think, in the European Journal of Political Research, that kind of argued, well, media effects are really not important to consider. And we have to kind of look at institutions and maybe politicians, but not at media if we kind of want to understand political outcomes, political behavior. So there was a lot of skepticism there. That has changed completely. Which is, I think, good news for us in general. But you still see some of those things kind of being reflected. That political scientists are mainly very proud for being a political scientist and always emphasize the political science side of what they do. And I have an office mate who's smiling here, who is already a communication scientist for a very long time, while she doesn't want to admit it, but still says to everybody, yeah, I studied history and then I did political science. Annelien never mentioning her very strong communication background in this regard. And I had to do to myself for a long time as well. So there's something there. We might get into that a little bit more. But getting back to the substance here, there has been a very good book by Wolfsveld from 10 years ago that kind of introduces the political communication field and themes in a very good way. And he introduces the politics media politics cycle, where he basically argues, well, things start with the political, with what political elites do, and political decisions that are actually kind of being made. That is being then picked up by media, who kind of, indeed, with all kind of news selection processes and framing and maybe bias and news values, these kind of things, kind of create a changed image of that political part, and that then kind of feeds back into politics, because that might then kind of affect public opinion, but also politicians and policymakers in general. And in this case, there's really the start is there with politics. But if you argue that this is a cycle, you could also say, why wouldn't we start with media? Media presents things that actually go on in the world that affects the political side, and that then kind of results in new media coverage and in adjusted way of presenting this political reality. And I think that basically this starting point within the cycle is very often different, where political scientists start with the politics part and the communication scientists start with the media part, you could kind of say. The interesting thing is that if we look at the bigger challenges in the discipline and the bigger challenges that are present in our fields, I think there are quite a few that that are shared, you could kind of say, and that you need to kind of answer or to address. Both from a political science perspective and a communication science perspective, to really get answers to the things that we want to know at the moment. And we see that for some of those challenges, the communication toolkit seems to be a little bit more fitting, and for others, the political science toolkit does. And for the first two and this is also again on the next positive list and something that I just kind of thought of. All right, so what are the things that I struggle with in my own work? Even if I kind of look at others, we see that measuring exposure is one key challenge that kind of remains and has maybe also become more prevalent in this high choice media environment, where we find it very difficult to identify which type of content is viewed by whom, right? Because we all use very different media, get all kind of information and content through algorithmic selection, through personalized selection, and all these kind of things. And methodologically, that means that there's a huge challenge. I mean, 25, 30 years ago, we could still kind of rely maybe on self-reports. We at least agree that that's maybe increasingly problematic. And what we see is all kind of developments that try to kind of deal with this, right? Data tracking, data donations, experience sampling methods, etc., mainly in the field of communication science. This happens. Then on the second one is if we're unable to kind of get that exposure for people, how do we kind of analyze the content? Because also that content and the diversity in that content has increased tremendously. And here we see that there are a lot of advancements in terms of computational methods, large language models, etc. We see that actually happening on both sides of the aisle, you could kind of say. But also here, it's mainly the communication scientists, we seem to be a little bit more at the forefront. And I'm a little bit... I'm less certain about this one than about the other one, because I know that there are a couple of very good examples of political scientists who are actually kind of employing very good computational methods to analyze content. But especially when it comes to the analyzing of media content, we see that the communication scientists are more at the forefront. Then with the third one is that comparative research has become more central in our attention, and also one of the challenges. How we kind of see more and more that we realize that effects are not similar across contexts, and what are then those context characteristics and the dynamics that might be very context specific that kind of determine, for example, media outcomes and media effects. And there we can rely way more on the comparative politics literature and on also the methodological rigor that political scientists actually have when addressing these type of questions. So that's so in that comparative part, there is a shared challenge that we see, that our studies, and that goes for both sides, are way too much US focused. And that makes comparing a lot more difficult, and also makes our image and ideas about, for example, detrimental effects of social media, of polarization process, and these kind of things, I think, biased and maybe even incorrect in many ways. And this context specificity is something that we need to kind of realize maybe more and more, and also kind of learn to develop the tools and the right methodological approaches to do small n country comparisons, but also large n country comparisons. And I think that this is a nice example. This is actually from a review study from a few years ago. It actually was in the appendix D or E of this study or something like that. But this is telling, right? If we kind of look at how many studies they kind of identified for the US and then compared to other countries, the difference is tremendous. So that means that I'm going to do two huge generalizations. And I think that what we could say as a criticism on both sides is that communication science focuses too heavily on communication content and effects, and fails to acknowledge the power struggles that feed into the content. So what do political actors, institutional and non-institutional actors, do to kind of inform that content, try to kind of influence the things that we see about politics and the images that we kind of get from the political in our societies, and effects beyond individual level cognitive effects. And I've also been talking a lot about in this individual levels style, but I think that in many ways and in many both methodologically and theoretically, it's also interesting, for example, to look more at dynamics that kind of take place over time and that, for example, play at the level of the political agenda or the parliament that might actually be affected by, for example, media content as well. And then for political scientists, you could also say that at least until recently, the focus is too heavily on institutions and fails to and studies fail to take properly into account communication content. And maybe also the hybrid and blurry character of politics in citizens' everyday life, right? So there's a little bit of a high road kind of idea about what good politics, a little bit of an underlying normative idea about what good political behavior actually should entail. So these are just general criticisms on both fields, and I very much invite you to challenge those in the Q&A that will follow. These things also translate into methodological flaws or methodological criticism that you can have on both sides. I say, or I would say that political scientists are in general incapable of doing a proper content analysis. This is something that you learn as a communication scientist, and that's one of the key fortes, you could even maybe say. And I'm not only talking about the computational part, but also about qualitative content analysis or manual quantitative content analysis. And I also very much feel that communication scientists are incapable of doing proper comparative research. And if we kind of look at the field, we see a lot more comparative studies, and it makes me very happy. But I also think that there's still a lot to learn from political science, and the fact that most communication scientists don't know the difference between the most similar and the most different systems design, and that follows a different logic, whether you compare countries that are similar in terms of the institutional context or different in terms of their institutional context is something that I think these questions should be way more salient for us to kind of address. Okay. This was the content and the methods, and there are a couple of obvious differences there. And we also see those differences in more of the institutional setting. We see APSA as maybe the main conference for political science, international speaking, the American Political Science Association, and the International Communication Association in communication science. Both have a political communication in the ICA. It's called a division. I know how it's called in the APSA, and they actually also share things because they, for example, political communication, the main journal in the field, is kind of both hosted by the APSA and ICA PolCom divisions, and some of the prizes that they kind of hand out are shared as well. And we see this basically distinction kind of existing also at all kind of different levels. If we look at the European level, we have the ECPR in political science, which now luckily enough has a political communication standing group, or what's called, and ECREA has a political communication division as well on the communication side. And also on the national or low countries level, we can see the NKWP and the VPW on the one hand, and then NeFCA on the other hand, both of them kind of having at least theoretically a place for political communication. And we see that at both of their major events, 2 times in Etmaal, we see that there will always be political communication content or workshops, and in the case of NeFCA, sessions being available. So 2 times in Etmaal. I'll say a little bit more about that Etmaal in a minute. What we do see is that there are 2 journals that you could kind of say that are truly interdisciplinary, or truly kind of crossing those boundaries in terms of political science, and in communication science, and that's, I think, political communication, and also the International Journal of Press Politics, though that one does lead a little bit more towards the communication discipline, I think, but especially political communication. And I think that there was also an analysis of where do actually the authors actually come from in that case, and that there's pretty equal distribution among political science or people in political science departments compared to communication science departments. Another interesting geographical difference to maybe mention in this regard is that it seems to be that in, and I already referred to that in the very first slide, that in the European context, political communication is more dominated by communication departments, while in the US, it seems to be mainly political science departments that include the leading political communication scholars. Also not one-to-one, a lot of exceptions here, but overall, I think that this is a little bit the pattern, and I don't know why. I have no clue. Finally, if we kind of look at the people and their culture, I think that in general, this ChatGPT generated image tells all the general, or tells you something about the ideas that exist about both disciplines, and in different ways. And the one thing is that communication science, we see that the share of female scholars is way higher than on the political science part, and we also see that the atmosphere and the general attitude in communication is a little bit more positive, I would say. And in political science, they are a little bit more critical. You could also say that they are more substance focused. So you can also say, oh, that it actually has a positive side, but I kind of like the grumpy face that kind of comes with it. And the times that I kind of really got very nasty questions for presentations was, well, I think 90% of the times there was actually a political science context rather than a communication context. It also translates into the structure of the etmals, for example, where we see that in political science we have 24 hours where we kind of sit with the same small group and really discuss full papers and take our time there for half an hour, 45 minutes per paper with a respondent, etc., etc. While the etma for the communicatiewetenschap is way more a show of highlights where we do 6 presentations in an hour and are mainly busy with networking rather than really going in depth into the content. And both have their upsides and downsides. I think that what a big upside is that there's dancing at communication science conferences and there's never dancing at political science conferences. And that we also see that at the etmal, there you're happy when at 10:30 at the political science part, you're still having a beer with a couple of nice colleagues, while in the communication situation, everybody goes loose on the dance floor from 9 p.m. onwards. So these are just some thoughts and ideas that I have or collected in the past years about the two disciplines, and I'm also very curious to hear whether you recognize those, or whether you say, well, no, it's actually something completely different, or you're making fun of the one or of the other. Feel very free to step in here and share your thoughts. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Rens, for a very stimulating presentation about the two fields in which you both work, where the difference lie, but also for stimulating us to bridging them or keep on bridging them. So let's move on indeed to the Q&A. I propose that you just raise your hand, or if you would like to add your question to the chat,